Hello, hi, welcome, and welcome back to this very class of American Church History. And this is Professor Hwang leading this class, and this is week number 5. So we are almost halfway done when today's class is over. So. As we continue to just learn and discuss about this American church history, to begin, actually going into the contents of the history, we are doing the concept of the history. What is the history, and why do we do the history? And last week we just kind of stopped in the middle of discussing why history. It depends on who you are. If you are a student, and you're doing this history so you can learn and educate yourself, which means you get the basic knowledge on the facts and the events and the people that had happened in the past history. And if you're, a scholar or professor, your reason of doing a history that you have a more deeper understanding of history. But whatever the case, whether you're a historian or a student of history, there are common reason why we need to do history. And even if we are not a student or a scholar, the history, it is quite important knowledge or perspective that you will have as a person who are living in this world. So let's just go over quickly on some of the reasons why we do the history. The first one, how it says help us develop a better understanding of the world. That it is, as you know, the history, you'll have the tools and ability to read and interpret what's going on around you, whether it's a small world around you, like a family, or your church, or it might be your workplace. I mean, as you understand the history of a nation and the people, that gives you that perspective, and it helps us to understand ourselves. It helps you to know who you are. And who our people is. If you're a Korean, knowing Korean history will be benefiting to know who you are, because you're going to identify yourself as a Korean or Chinese or American. So knowing your ethnic heritage or where you came from, who your parents or the grandparents came from, that helps you to understand and to identify yourself as an ethnic person, because every person on earth has a certain ethnicity, and in 21st century, the ethnicity is one of the big issues that we need to think of. And especially, if you live in America, this is a country where all the ethnic groups from the globe, the earth, they come together to form a nation. That's what the ideally US is. Even though some of the people, so-called majority white or white majority, they think they are the ruling class. which is not the actual American spirit. And even the president was thinking in a different way, and that is not only politically, it's ethnically wrong. So probably he didn't have that perspective of history, and that's why he is so confused and out of his mind. So that was the case. I'm sure that he either flunked or he didn't do good on history. Number 3, it helps us to learn and understand other people. Not only yourself, it helps other people, other ethnic groups especially. And as a student of American church history, if you identify yourself as an American church, part of American church, knowing American church history and learning, it will help you to understand the other churches that are out there, whether it's a Korean church, Chinese church, or Filipino church, whatever these churches are. By knowing who you are, what your church is, that you will have further understanding of other ethnic churches. Then it teaches a working understanding of change. This is important. The world we are in, since its beginning, Genesis chapter 1 verse 1. From there, as God created the heavens and the earth, and since then there has constant change. Change is the nature of history. It's a very key element in history. So that means trying to understand and to study and to know history, it means to understand that change. You see the changes that happened in the past, and you read the change that's happening today, and you kind of predict and prepare yourself toward that change that is going to come. Or you are going to be the one that who initiates that the change, or bring the change in the future, which is basically what the Christians are and who we are. The Christians are the changing agents. In this world. So basically, some people believe being a Christian is going to the church and praying a lot and doing Bible study and listening to the sermons so you can be a religious person. Well, yeah, that's a part of it. But many loses the core of Christianity by just putting themselves into that frame, that small frame, very narrow perspective on Christianity. That's not the intent of God or intent of Jesus Christ, who's been here on earth for 30 some years, leaving a very definite mark in history. What he has been doing, as a Messiah, he not only saved us, the souls and the spirits, he wanted to bring the change. Not just a change or just small changes, but he wanted to bring the change. And where? In the world, toward the world. So that's who we are. The Christians are the changing agents in this world. Your word might be small, or your word might be big. It could be just one person, or it begins with yourself, because you're part of the world. And the Christianity begins as change in you first, and then it brings to next and the next person, or the person that God has given to you. And indeed, in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, and Jesus at the last day of his life on earth, and he's going to be crucified next day. He knew that. And then he offers this prayer to God the Father, and says, "No, I have done what you have given me to do, and which is to bring all the people who you have given to me." And then that's the world that you are responsible. And for the time of Jesus, it was Jews basically, and there were the multitude who followed Jesus, and then out of those multitude, there are someone who are called the disciples, and out of these disciples, there has been 12 apostles later on. They are the core key people who were given as the word to Jesus. Of course, Jesus being God himself, he was able to bring all the people to the change. Because he is God, he was able to do. But the God the Father had a different plan, because God wanted us to be, the human generation, ourselves, to be the very changing agents, the church. That's what the church is. The church is changing agents. So as we read the American church history and study the history of American church, we want to see how they took the role as a changing agent in this particular time of history, in this particular time, the particular place. So, history always is a looking at the given time and a given place and given people. So what the history is, as we see those elements, the place, time, and the people, they bring certain events, episode, and then that episode and the story, the narrative, including the people and events, it certainly brings the change. So we want to see what kind of change it brings to the world that is given at the time, the space, and the people they are responsible. So again, it has to do with the change, and we are looking at the change that the American church has brought to this world, including America, North America, South America, Africa, and Asia, and so on. And did they do what God had commanded to do to them? So again, God commands a certain responsibility to bring the change. That responsibility or mandate is to bring in the change to the world. And our perspective should see, did they do it? And which also is applicable to you yourself. If you're a Christian, if you're living in America and you're part of American church, whether you're Korean and Chinese, Japanese, doesn't matter. You are American while you're on the American soil. It's not like a political or a diplomatic definition. Once you landed in America, this land of America, then you become an American according to the biblical definition, identity of you. So as an American, I mean, even though you're ethnic Korean, ethnic Chinese, still you are an American, part of American church. So it is for us, I mean, important for us to look into that American church as a part of that church to bring the necessary change that was commanded and demanded and mandated by God. And our job, your job is to identify and exactly find out what your mandate is as a part of an American church. Whether you're Korean American, Chinese American, you know, once you put your foot on this soil, you become a part of American church and American church history. And it has to do with the understanding that change. And by doing the history, it gives us the tools we need to be decent citizens. For us, instead of a citizen, it will be Christian. So by doing the history, you become a decent Christian, or a learned, educated, and trained, discipled, and equipped Christian. So every Christian, I mean, if you're a Christian, you are responsible to be discipled. I mean, that is the life mandate. Some Christians, they think since they are saved, I mean, there's after salvation, that's it, and you just go get wait for the heaven, and you just live, and then you'll end up in heaven. And that's not the kind of salvation that Jesus had taught when he was aiming to bring the change in you. Because being a Christian, it means you are in the course of, or as you are a part of that change. What is the change what kind of change are we talking about? That's so-called biblical change. What is a biblical change? It includes all the kind of change for the positive. What's the positive here? Positive means as God had intended originally when he created us. Not only Adam and Eve, but he created us the same as a human being. And once he intended for that creation, the millions and billions of people on earth, every and each soul, God intended us to be perfect as a person, and complete as a person. And he had the design, so-called in the image of God and in the likeness of God. That was the design that God had. And actually we are far from it. We are, I mean, currently the reality that we are in, even though as a Christian we are still very far from that image of God and the likeness of God. Thus, the change is necessary, and this change is called grow. You need to grow. Constantly grow to the state of toward Jesus Christ. So the status of Jesus Christ, I mean, it's beyond our imagination. It's unlimited. Actually, it's unlimited, and we're trying to grow up to that standard. So that's being a decent Christian. And how do we do it? Of course, we do it by reading the Bible and understanding, and then prayer, and then biblical discipline. But as a part of it, we need to be able to understand that history, because Bible itself, all the narratives that read in the Bible, that's a history. So, being a good historian yourself, a good student of history, is a key to this so-called Christian growth. And it helps us to make better decisions. That's very, very important element as we do the history. There are those without historical perspective. They have the same, let's say these two people has the same education, same training, and all the same ability, except having to have that balanced and holistic historical perspective. See, one has this historical perspective, one does not. And it will make a very critical difference. The one who is with a historical perspective, well balanced and trained historical perspective, he or she is going to make much better decision when he or she faces these problems and issues and troubles. And I mean, life is full of issues and troubles. And one who has that historical perspective and historical understanding, he or she will make a much better decisions. Whether it's in own personal life, whether it's in your workplace, if you're running a business, having the historical perspective is a very key element. You may ask, what does it has to do? I mean, what does the history has to do with the doing business? I'll answer a lot. Because those without historical perspective, they'll make more mistakes. They'll make more wrong decisions. They'll fail a lot more often than one who has the or good historical perspective or understanding. Because basically your own life, it is a history. As a personal, as an individual, it might be small, but your life is a history itself. It's a narrative. Our narrative is a history. And basically history is a narrative. And the key is how you understand that narrative. And if you have a good perspective on your own life, and that means you have good perspective or on your own history. So how do you make a good decision by having the history? Number one, you understand the principles in life, principles in the world by looking at history. And then you can apply those principles. Once you know it, the key is the making application. Now there are some people, who has a good knowledge, good understanding, but they are not able to apply that to the actual reality, the life that they are living in. Well, that might be the case, but most of us who are having good understanding should be able to apply those understanding and principle to the actual life case. And by doing so, you're going to make a much better decision, a less trial and error. So basically it helps you to avoid See, this trial and errors, that's basically the way we learn the life. I mean, as a baby, I mean, you're not going to be able to learn how to walk unless you fall 1,000 times, at least 1,000 times. That's how babies learn to, to walk. Same thing with the bicycle riding, swimming. I mean, everything that happens in your life and this life, you have to do trial and errors, and you cannot avoid it. But you can at least reduce the numbers of trial and errors. So whether it's your job, business, work, or study, or your life, your marriage, everything, it requires trial and errors. Because for you, it's going to be the first time, it's going to be always first time to do this and that. And then usually it does not, you're not going to be successful at the first time, first trial. That's how the life it is. And people are so afraid of making those failures. No, it is a requirement in many cases. As we read the history and understand the history, American church history and your own Christian life, there has been so many trial and errors. And that's how we learn and educate ourselves and become a better person and better church and better community and better nation. We should learn from those mistakes. And but having the good perspective and understanding of history, it helps you to reduce. It helps you to reduce those mistakes and the trial and errors. Then the last of the list, but you can think of many more reasons for history, but on the list, it helps us develop a new level of appreciation for just about everything. Yeah, and this is the credit. I took it from the Arcadia Publishing. So that's not my own idea. Even though the lecture is my own idea, I give the credit to that particular publishing. Anyway, see, you're going to appreciate the church, and then everything that involves yourself. So, if indeed the doing of history, learning the history, and spending time here listening to my lecture, and then reading the books and the records about the American church history, then if it helps you to appreciate everything, why not? It is, very important elements. So yeah, we have discussed that. Science or art. History is and should be a science. History is not the accumulation of events of every kind which happens in the past. It is the science of a human society. Which means, I mean, you are going to be selective. You make that guess judgment. You are going to eliminate, certain things, edit the history, and then try to, light or focus on those important events, and you have to make that judgment, and that judgment has to be very objective, not creative. Art that requires certain creativity. It demands the creativity is the first element of art, but doing history, the very element is science. But from the other perspective, history does require interpretation. We as a person have at least 3 dimensions in our makeup. One is cognitive, what happens in your brain, the mathematics and chemistry and these things, it happens there. Then we have something called affective. Affective is your emotional side. What you feel, how you perceive the things, and that depends on that. You cannot make your feeling objective. It's very subjective, and it's who you are. So you cannot avoid being subjective, while the world also requires you to be objective. And some people is so into their own subjectivity, they are not able to, see other from the objective perspective. I mean, for the modern world, this becomes a very serious element. The problem. The history requires both. It needs very cognitive function, but the interpretation involves much of affective dimension of your being. So it does demand your emotion, your inner response, which is not so scientific at all. So it's an art and as well as science. So doing a history, while you're gathering the information, data, and make a story proper, that takes a science. Archaeology is a science. But the interpretation of archaeology, it becomes an art. You've never been there, you're guessing with all this data and information, but who's guessing? It is every individual historian who's making up the story. Even though it's educated guess, they are going to come out with many different interpretations. Thus, it is an art as well. Okay. All right, let's take a quick break and I'll come back. Okay, we are back from the short break. Now, the historical perspective, we have covered this briefly. The perspective, you may have two very distinctive, different perspectives on history. As we study history, one perspective is called so-called secular perspective. Secular perspective, that's common, general. Everyone who does a history, they are usually start with a secular perspective history. Then there's a Christian perspective. When I say Christian perspective, that does not mean that you're so focused on a church history only. Even the history, as we read the American history or Chinese history, Korean history, you will be able to apply your Christian perspective to that history. Even though your history book does not say anything about God, not a single word about God, the Christian perspective of history should be able to see how God has moved the kings and the people toward the very end of God completing his mission for the kingdom. So that's what we call a Christian perspective. Because if you are a Christian, a believer, we are required as a Christian or Christians to see and understand everything around us with that Christian perspective. The reality, that's the key word that I use often. And the reality around us, or so it's a pretty similar concept. Reality and actuality versus ideal or ideality. So every human being, I couldn't say every, but most human being with a sound mind, they know and they have something so-called ideal or ideality. Ideality is the place and the condition and context where this ideal thinking is real. But the reality that we face is not ideal. That's the very basic assumption of the life or the history itself. So we know what's the ideal. There is, even though you cannot agree, let's give an example. One ideal about your life is that you want to live long or even forever. There's the very famous Chinese emperor, Jinshi, I think is. I don't know exact pronunciation in Chinese, but in Korea we call it Jinsi. And this king searched it, and he sent, many of his servants to look for that very medicine or plants, whatever, to help him to live forever. So it's not just for that king, but it is everyone who is hoping that they will live forever, so-called eternity. That's why the eternal life is a big key concept and issue in Christianity and every other religion. The salvation, it always has to do with heaven, or having to have that eternal life. Those are called ideal or ideality. And going back to this perspective, we are going to be able to see the reality and actuality by doing the history, or having to have historical perspective. So always us have that two different perspectives of ideality and reality, and then there's a so-called Christian ideal, and there's something called secular ideals. Those are one of the categories to view the history. And church and kingdom perspective, let me skip that one. And then people and events. You're going to look at the people, and you're going to look at the events. And as you read the people and the events, it brings you to that very area of interpretation. So the perspective has to do with interpretation. So perspective means how you are going to interpret that people and events. From what position? Are you going to do it as a Christian or non-Christian? Or even secular or even anti-Christian? Are you going to do it from the right-wing perspective, or are you going to do it from the left-wing perspective? So political, so religious perspective, political perspectives, and social perspectives, and ethnic perspectives. These are some of the examples of the perspectives on doing history. For example, if you're an Afro-American, your perspective and your understanding and reading of history, American church history, would be much different from those white folks. See, as I told you, I believe last week, the majority of writings in American church history is done by the white Anglo-Saxon, ethnically speaking. Okay, and then this is much of this Afro-American church history is left out. They are not dealt with, because at the time of that history, until very recent, meaning last 40, 50 years, other than that, the African American, their existence and their identity and their role in American history has been very ignored. And the same with the American church history. That's unfortunate, but that is what it is. So if you're an Afro-American who's studying American church history, your perspective is going to be much different from those of white ones. See, that's what the perspectives are, and it involves interpretation. This is where these differences come in. You may have very different or even sometimes contradicting perspectives, and that's where the academic, growth or advance occurs once you have those contradictions. So contradiction is not always bad. It's not always bad. Sometimes it helps you to become more creative and balanced. Okay? So don't be afraid to have those controversy, contradiction, argument, and differences. God had intended us to be different, man and woman. And then all these different languages and ethnicity, even though it came from our own fault, God had used those occasions to create the diversity. And see, having the diversity always, in reality, it has the positive and negative. So as we read the American church history, there are many controversies and contradictions, and then conflicts. And understanding and interpreting the conflicts within the history, the people and the events, that is very important objectives of doing a history. So as we experience conflicts, even among the believers today, let's say it will hopefully it will bring us a very creative result, bringing the change, the very necessary change in our lives to make us better. So conflicts has to be there if we are to grow and mature. You cannot avoid it, and we read these conflicts and contradictions and the controversies in the history, and which would educate you and develop your own perspective about and on history. So the facts and interpretation, see, even though we are dealing with the same facts, the interpretation may be far from east to the west. So that's how the history is. So, I'm not going to present you with just one perspective. Usually, this class being is in a college level, we just say these are the controversies, and there are these two different perspective and interpretations, or more different interpretation, and we just learn them, and then you're going to be the judge of your own judge of making that choice. Okay, the very key, the conclusion of this chapter is, why do we do church history? Because of the divine plan. Divine plan means God's plan. By doing American church history, we'll be able to see what the God's plan is, the ultimate plan of God. God has planned, and the many different plans under. That's how God works. That's how you work too. God has the plan, the ultimate plan, very big picture. And out of that plan, God has many small plans. And you are, if you're a Christian, and even though you're not Christian, you're part of that picture. And you're one of those small plans. And those plans, whether it's small or big, you are important. Because without those small plans, the big picture, the plan cannot be accomplished. So you have to figure out as a believer and as a Christian, what is the significance of your presence, your part in that big plan. That's how we do the history. You're trying to figure out who you are, what you need to do, what the significance of your presence, your role in this big picture. So history helps you to figure out that. And actually the church is there to help you to provide you with the tools so you can figure that out yourself. You're not to be told, unless God tells you directly, you're not to be told what you need to do as a Christian in your life. And sadly and unfortunately, that has been the case in many Korean churches. Pastors, you do have the authority or an authority from the God to teach the Bible and to disciple and nurture and pastor your sheep, your lamb. That's who you are. But that does not mean you have the authority to tell and direct and manipulate their lives. And unfortunately, that has been the case or cases in many these Asian churches, because there's a so-called this Confucius culture, which is very vertical and down to the command and in a shape of pyramid and in the form of hierarchy. Hierarchy says, on the top, if you're on the top, you have all the power and authority to rule over these who are under you. That's the basic paradigm and the framework of Asian culture. Because of the culture, they generally and easily accept that authority from the pastor or the spiritual figure, the leader figure. And some of the pastors abused that culture, and that some intentionally, some unintentionally, they did that. And that brought more harm than good to the church. That's how I see. As you read and study the church history in Asian churches, Korea, Japan, and China, we do see those negative facts. So, if you know the divine plan according to the, by doing a proper church history, you'll be able to avoid those kind of things. And we're going to read divine intervention. God, He does not intervene every single events in your life, even though He is looking at you and He's doing everything possible so He can, you can come closer to Him. That does not mean that He's going to be intervene and try to control everything that you do. But that's how we most Asian believers perceive God to be. No, he's not doing that. He wants to communicate with you, and he wants to work with you, which is very alien concept for us Asians, most Asians. Working with someone who is over you, that doesn't make sense. You are told to do what to do. How to do even, and where to do. That's much easier for us. But God does not do that. Okay? God says, here's the plan, here's the purpose, here's the goal, here's the ultimate. Tell me how you're gonna do it. That's how God approaches us, and He does help you to do it. That does not mean that He's gonna control you, and He's gonna direct you everything and tell you everything. As you do the American church history and the church history in general, you will find out how God intervenes when, where, in what point. And thus you understand your Christian life better. Signs of the day. There is something called major events, key events, or the moment of kairos. Kairos is a Greek word for the time, and there are two different words for time. The main two different words for the time. Kairos and Chronos. Chronos is a scientific time. Hour, minute, and second. That's how we measure the time. And according to Chronos, every time is the same. But Kairos is a time with a significance. Sometimes you feel the time flies. Actually it does. Time flies. You feel like you spent only 10 minutes, and then it's been an hour already. You know what I'm talking about. And on the other hand, it looks like and feels like you have been spending an hour, and then actually it's only 10 minutes gone. See, that's different perception of the time, and that's has to do with the kairos. Some of the time that we spend is more important and significant than other times. That's kairos. So as we read through the history, we are focusing on the moment of kairos. That's where and when God works more intensely with you. See, I told you that there's a different significance in your time, in your own life, and in the history of American church, and the history of any of the your churches. There has been that moment of kairos, very significant time. And those times, there are certain signs of the day. Signs of the day means it kind of says this is a very significant time of history of your life. And then you need to realize it, and you need to catch it, and you need to understand it, and prepare for what's coming. Because science says this is going to come, this is going to be there, you need to be ready, and so on and so on. And the best known signs of the time, signs of the day, would be when the final day comes. The history is going to end eventually it's going to end. And the God is going to take away the time, because He gave the beginning and then He said there is going to be the end. So we are running from the beginning toward the end. That's how we perceive the time in Christian perspective. Many Asian countries or people believe time kind of runs in a circle, never ending. But the biblical perspective of time says God created the time and then He's going to take away that time. So there, when the end comes, there are going to be those signs. But as we read the church history, we are going to find those signs, or the signs of the time, signs of the day. And it helps you to identify leaders. By studying the history, you will be able to select and kind of figure out who the leaders are. How do we do that? We look at the leaders in the past, and then you'll know who are the good leaders and what kind of signs those leaders kind of show. And you're looking into those signs, those hints. And why do I say that? Because if you are a church leader yourself, the very key to having the healthy and strong church is by appointing. I said appointing, you're not just electing. I don't believe in election of leaders. I believe in the appointing and anointing of leaders. That's how the Bible does. Unless you have 4 or 5 different good leaders and you have to choose one out of them, then you'll have some other ways like picking and or election. That's fine. But once you need to at least appoint the qualified leaders. And if you do not do that, if you fail to appoint a qualified leaders, the key word is qualified leaders, then you're going to have very failure. I mean, it's ready-made recipe for disaster, the failure of church. And I see so many incidents, and the actual happenings in that short church history I experienced with the Korean American churches. The major mistake of current Korean American church, and at least I can talk about in Southern California, is the failure to appoint qualified leaders or mature leaders or committed leaders. So 2 qualifications. They need to be mature, they need to be committed. I mean, these things go together. If you're committed, you need to be mature, and if you're mature, you're going to be committed. But in reality, that's 2 different stories. They look committed, but they not mature. Usually that will be the case. And many leaders kind of mistake this commitment as maturity, which is never. I mean, it has to be. I mean, proper Christian growth, the maturity and commitment goes together, but in reality it does not. So if someone is so enthusiastic and diligent and I mean, show the behavior of enthusiasm. Don't mistake that as commitment. That's my advice. So the commitment and the act of this diligence and work ethics, that's two different things. Anyway, coming back. Reading the church history, it confirms my perspective that leaders need to be appointed by the mature leaders. If the leader who are appointing the other leaders, he or she is not mature enough, then you don't need to say any further. But supposing a leader is mature and the pastor is the mature one and committed one, qualified leader, then you need to appoint. You have to appoint other leaders, not to the election by just general audience or general members of church. That's not how we do it. Critical review of present. It helps you to review and see what your current situation is without having to have the historical perspective. You're not going to be able to do that. Even if you do, it's going to be very spontaneous. Spontaneous means instant and not considering all the experience and data and past history. Unfortunately, many church leaders, because they do not have this perspective of history, they are not able to read the narrative, and they do not understand what the present is telling them. Because the present, who you are, the reality and the actuality that you are in, it tells a lot about the past, present, and future. So as you see where you are now, today, and who these people are today, then you can project toward the future. You will be able to see the problems, and you try your best to amend or fix that problem. Without fixing those problems, that you're not going to be able to have a better picture. That's not possible. But many believers say, you pray hard, then those problems will be fixed. No, it's not that automatic. Because you have to do your part. God wants you to do your part. And, planning your future. I mean, if your future is going to be given automatically, you not doing anything else, just sit and pray. I mean, that's nonsense. But some Christians believe that you sit and pray and then it will be given. Yeah, there are certain things that will be given that's beyond your ability or your capacity, and if it's totally purely God's domain, He has to work. But other than that, 90% of what we do as Christian believers, the life and the church, it is your responsibility. It's human responsibility. We have to do something to make it happen. So that's where we are. So we will look into the future if you do the good history. So if you do not do the history, you're losing all these benefits, good things. Well, yeah, you can live. It doesn't kill you. It's not going to kill you because you do not do the history. That's not how it works. But you're going to lose all these benefits. And see, the leaders, if you're a leader in a church, you need to do history. Because without these benefits, you're not going to be a leader. you cannot be a successful leader in a church or wherever, even in a secular place. So that's the more, I mean, the emphasis of the importance of doing history. I spent the half of my class lesson on the concept and the reason for doing history. Because without this, the reason, the motivation, the following the facts and the events and the what had happened in American church history, there would be nothing. It doesn't mean anything but just list of events and facts. So thank you, and that will conclude class for week number 5, and I'll be seeing you next week. Thank you for listening, and see you again.